It's fabulous to be here, and thanks to everyone for coming along. And as Rosa said, I'm here to talk about the WIMP study, the Wagering, Inducements and Marketing project. It was interesting, the guys didn't like that acronym much and they kept wanting to contract it to WIM, Wagering, Inducements and Marketing. I'm going, it's got to have the P on the end, the project. So anyway, first of all, look, thank you to the Foundation for funding this particular project. We greatly appreciate that, and I'd also like to acknowledge the big cast of co-investigators on this project. As you'll see today, it was a multi-stage project, a large project, and I certainly couldn't have done it or wouldn't have wanted to do it on my own. Two of those co-investigators are here today, Nancy Greer in the front and Vijay Rawat also as well, and other investigators from both CQU and Australian Institute for Family Studies as well. So that exciting on this slide, I thought I'd let you know where we're going. Just wanted to give you a little bit of background on the growth of wagering and wagering marketing in Australia over the last little while. Talk a little bit about previous research in very general terms on wagering advertising. Obviously introduce this WIMP study, go through some key results from some various stages and draw some conclusions and considerations from that. It's no surprise to people in this room, of course, that sports and race betting has been increasing in Australia over the last several years, and so the latest statistics from the Australian gambling statistics show that sports betting increased about 15% and race betting increased about 7% last year over the previous 12 months. And of all forms of gambling, they're the only ones which are really showing any increase over the last few years, and some sectors are actually in decline or at least very stable. So they're the newish kids on the block, and I guess watch this space in the future in terms of the impacts of sports betting and race betting more generally. And there's a whole lot of reasons for that growth. Regulation has enabled that growth. There are more betting opportunities than ever before. Of course, easy access online and mobile technologies. So, you know, people now have a betting app in their pocket on their smartphone, of course. And along with that increase, we've seen the increase in wagering advertising. So I think people, you must have been living in a cave if you haven't seen a raft of wagering advertising increasing over the last several years. So commercial advertising such as advertisements on television, of course, during sporting events, radio, print, online, etc. We see a lot of sponsored advertising, so you watch sports now and you know, there are lots of logos of sports betting companies and race betting companies, and it's on the sort of perimeter fencing and the scoreboards and player uniforms. And we see also digital advertising, so online, but also direct messaging as well through emails and apps and SMS and direct phone calls to punters as well. So there's been a big increase in diversification, I guess, in the types of advertising that we're seeing to do with wagering. And we also now have a proliferation of wagering inducements, so things like the offering of bonus bets and refunds, better odds, better winnings, rewards points, those sorts of things, as incentives to place bets. And of course all of those trends then have increased concerns about the effects of that advertising on betting behaviour. So just to, in case people sometimes get a little bit confused about what we might mean by wagering inducements, this is just a selection that I grabbed off the net really of some of the types of inducements that are around. So multi-bet specials, sign-up bonuses, refer a friend bonuses, double your winnings, increased odds, those sorts of things are what we're referring to when we talk about inducements today. So I guess when we think about advertising and its effects, not just on gambling, but there are generally two arguments put forward for what effects advertising might have. And in relation to gambling, that first argument was certainly pushed very much by the gambling industry in various government inquiries, or has been pushed by them. So the Productivity Commission inquiry way back in 1999 and again in 2010, industry came out and said, look, our advertising doesn't increase the total pie of consumption. we do it so that we can grab market share. So the pie of gambling consumption stays the same. We advertise because we want to try and maximise our share of that pie. So that's one argument. And then the other argument is that advertising actually does increase the size of the pie. It increases that sales, that consumption level overall. And we don't really, or up until now, I guess, we haven't really known, what the case might be. And so I think it's fair to say that there are concerns for public health if advertisements and inducements cause extra people to be harmed, if they worsen problems amongst people who are already being harmed, or if they impede recovery from problems or trigger relapse amongst people with gambling problems. And we now know, of course, that gambling harm is much more widespread than what we possibly recognised before, and that a lot of harm is happening at the levels of sort of low risk and moderate risk gambling and not just at the level of problem gambling. So we already have a large pool of people potentially being harmed by gambling and in this case specifically wagering, and what we don't want to happen is for that pool to grow or for the severity of those harms to get any worse. Okay, so previous research then into gambling advertising and wagering advertising. We've had, several qualitative studies. We've had quite a few cross-sectional studies looking at the links between exposure to advertising and behaviour. And generally what those studies have found is that, yes, increased exposure leads to increased betting. Usually, some of them have highlighted that increased exposure leads to more positive attitudes to gambling and stronger intentions to bet, and then increased betting expenditure and time spent on betting. And some studies have also drawn a link between exposure to advertising and more likelihood of betting on impulse, so responding impulsively to advertisements by betting, and also in the context of wagering, of opening more betting accounts, particularly to get things like sign-up bonuses and things like that. And those studies have generally found that higher risk gamblers, so those more towards the pointy end of the gambling continuum, report stronger effects than those at the non-pointy end. But these studies really are self-report, so they've tended to just ask people, how has this advertising impacted on you? Or they've measured exposure and measured expenditure, for example, and tried to draw associations between them. So those sorts of self-reports can be useful, but I guess on their own they're unreliable because advertising works in subtle ways and we're not always conscious of the influence of advertising. And there's a thing called a third-person effect. So a lot of studies have found that if you ask people, does advertising impact you? They all say, oh no, it doesn't affect me, but I'm really worried about the impact of advertising on everybody else. Everyone else is susceptible to it. So, and of course, in this sort of area with these cross-sectional designs, it's very hard to be clear about what the causal direction is. So we can imagine it's very possible that increased exposure to advertising increases betting behaviour, but it's equally plausible that increased betting behaviour exposes you to more advertising. Yeah, because you're on your app, you're online, putting on bets, you're probably more likely to be watching the races or watching the sporting event that you've bet on. So a tricky area to work in. Okay, so the WIMP study, as we said, commissioned by the VRGF, and we conducted it over the last couple of years. And it was the main aim was to examine the effects of wagering advertising, including inducements, on betting behaviour, and to look at that by gambler risk group. We had several stages of methodology there that you'll see. Sorry, they're doing some building downstairs, I think. And what we were trying to do was to sort of overcome some of the weaknesses of previous research. We certainly couldn't overcome all of those, but we hoped by using multiple sources of evidence and multiple methodologies that we'd be able to get a fair bit closer to where the truth might be. So you can see the different stages up there. I won't read that out. I don't think I'm going to get through all of those today, but I'll talk first of all about the EMA study, the Ecological Momentary Assessment Study, and some of the other steps or stages as well. So the EMA study, some of you may have heard of this methodology. It's becoming more widely used. It's beneficial in that it produces or yields longitudinal data that's collected via multiple very short surveys. And the data is collected very much in close to real time. So in this study we were asking people, giving them multiple short surveys, asking them about what types of advertising and inducements they'd been exposed to in the last little while and what their betting expenditure had been in that same period. So we're hoping to minimise recall bias. It's very difficult for people to remember, hey Case, when you say, you know, what did you spend last year on gambling or last month? People find that very difficult to remember. So we're trying to minimise recall bias. So we started with baseline samples of 400 odd regular, in this case at least fortnightly race bettors, and 320 regular sports bettors. We gave them a baseline survey which measured demographics, problem gambling severity index, and some basic questions on their betting behaviour. And then we conducted or administered these EMA surveys. So we had 15 short surveys administered by SMS over 3 one-week periods during the relevant racing and sports betting season. So we sent them out on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday and Sunday in 3 non-consecutive weeks. And Nancy and VJ down the front will remember that well. It was a lot of work logistically and otherwise. So thank you for your enormous amount of behind-the-scenes work on that. So the surveys asked about the previous 24 or 48 hours since the last survey. As I said, it asked about betting expenditure, what types of adverts and inducements people had been exposed to in that time period. It did ask about some perceptions. So did they report that those adverts or inducements had encouraged them to bet more or less, or larger, or place larger or smaller bets, or riskier or safer bets. And then we asked them about their intended betting expenditure for the next 24 to 48 hours or until the next survey. So just to show you some results from this, this shows exposure to advertisements. So, you know, there's no doubt that these folks had very frequent and ongoing exposure to these advertisements and inducements across numerous media. And we asked about 9 different types of advertisements, which are there on the screen. And most of the respondents, participants, saw most of the 9 types of advertisements on at least half of the days they were surveyed. So very frequent exposure. And the figures there show the mean percentage of survey days on which respondents saw each type of advert. So for example, the most frequently seen was TV advertisements for betting, which the sports bettors and race bettors saw on 68 to 69% of the days they were surveyed. Betting brands promoted during events were very commonly seen. Adverts on betting websites and apps, direct messages, that is emails, SMSs, phone calls, and commentary promoting betting during events was seen the most frequently. Same sort of table for inducements. So the typical participant, I guess, saw most of the 11 types of inducements on at least a third of the days that they were surveyed, and some more often. So the most frequently seen was a multi-bet offer seen by sports bettors on 60% of the days they were surveyed, and race bettors on 53% of the days they were surveyed, followed by stake-back offers, so things offering you refunds, offers to match your stake or deposit, cashing out early on a multi-bet, rewards programs, sign-up bonuses, and offers for better odds and winnings. So there's no doubt from those descriptive tables that punters are, receive very frequent and ongoing exposure to these types of advertisements and inducements. Now the longitudinal analysis, remembering that we had 15 surveys, not everybody did 15 surveys, we obviously had a bit of dropout, but people did up to 15 surveys. So we had this longitudinal data and we could look at exposure to advertisements and inducements and associations with expenditure, and we could do that in a longitudinal way. Not me, because I'm not a statistician at all, but this is Matt Brown's work. Many of you know Matt Brown. So I'm just reading here what he did really. Linear mixed effects models. Don't ask me any complicated questions about that, please. Or we can refer them to Matt or read the report. So what this aimed to test was whether exposure to wagering adverts and inducements influences actual betting expenditure, so what people had spent in that same 24 hours that they'd been exposed to these adverts and inducements, whether it affected their intended expenditure, so the next 24 hours, and whether it affected or was associated with spending more than intended. So what you intended to bet, or the actual minus the intended for the same 24 hours. And also, did that differ by problem gambling severity group? Okay, I could have put up the model with all these numbers, but I thought, who wants to look at that? Chris would want to look at that. The keen status, and Crystal would love to see that. Where's Crystal? Sorry. Okay, it's in the report if you want numbers. I thought, let's get to the take-home message here. So we looked at, first thing we did was look at the total aggregate exposure. So it was a simple sum score. We simply added up how many types of advertisements and inducements people had been exposed to over that, in that particular, for each day that they were surveyed. Sorry. What we then found was that greater total exposure to those adverts and inducements predicted the likelihood of betting on race betting and sports betting versus not betting on them, intended amount of expenditure on both race betting and sports betting, actual expenditure on those two forms, and spending more than intended but only for race betting. So we're seeing a direct association there between the amount of advertising being seen and the amount of the likelihood of betting, and how much you intend to bet and how much you do bet, and in the case of race betting, betting more than you intended. But no differential effects by problem gambling severity group. So it affected, those effects were found for all PGSI groups. I think the table below is an interesting one, and this was sort of a bit of further analysis we did when we, in preparation or after, we spoke to the ministerial advisor, I think. He actually said to us, well, what was the dollar increase that people bet after they were exposed to these advertisements and inducements? And we thought, oh, good question, we hadn't really thought of that. So hence this table. So what it shows is that if we just take inducements and sports bettors, for example, on average, if people were exposed, or sports bettors were exposed to 0 inducements per day, the average expenditure on betting was $33.40 on that day. If they were exposed to 5 or more inducements, their average expenditure was $67.35. So I guess just eyeballing those figures, we can see that a fairly or very steady increase as exposure increases from 0 to 1 to 4 types of ads inducements to 5+, and we can see the gradual dollar increase for each of those levels of exposure. So that held true for both inducements and advertisements, and for both sports bettors and race bettors. Okay, we then looked at, so the previous slide was looking at the aggregate exposure, total exposure to advertisements, inducements, how many times people saw these things. Matt then did further analysis to look at what were the most influential adverts and inducements. Again, no tables, no figures. The die-hard stats people in the room can have a look at the report. To summarise the findings, the most influential types of advertisements were betting brands promoted during events. That was both for race betting and sports betting. Advertisements on betting websites and apps, again for both forms of betting. Direct messages for race bettors. And commentary promoting betting during events, also for race betting. Do you think they're agreeing or protesting? In terms of inducements, the most influential types of inducements were stake-back offers, so offering a refund under certain conditions, obviously, to race bettors, multi-bet offers for sports bettors, and inducements offering reward points for sports bettors as well. So, and those results, which were done through the linear mixed effects models analysis, were pretty consistent with the self-reports. You might remember I noted that we asked people how they were influenced by those different ads and inducements, and there was a lot of consistency there. And so another, I guess, result to add then is most people self-reported that the advertisements and inducements were more likely to lead them to bet more rather than less, and to place larger bets rather than fewer bets. We also asked people, and this is simply self-report, whether those advertisements and inducements, or each type, encourage them to place riskier bets or safer bets. And in our minds, we were thinking of safer bets as being sort of shorter odds and riskier bets being longer odds. But when we got the results, the race bettors reported that exposure to advertisements and inducements ended up, resulted in them placing riskier bets. But the sports bettors reported that they ended up placing safer bets. And I thought, oh, that's an odd result. But I think, I'm not sure, I'm speculating, but I think the interpretation that some of those people may have given to safer bets was that, okay, if we're offering, if they're offered bonus bets or a refund or something for nothing, then that makes their betting a bit safer, rather than thinking about the odds itself. But I was a little concerned with that, thinking, well, maybe these inducements are actually encouraging people to think it's a safer betting strategy if they use those inducements and if they don't use them, but anyway. Okay, so what we wanted to do under experimental conditions was to test if wagering inducements lead to riskier bets, and in this case we meant longer odds. So we wanted to know, does people's betting change in response to some of these inducements, and again whether that differs by PGSI group. I think our target was 300 sports bettors, but we ended up with 299. We gave these people a video game simulation. I'll show you some of that in a minute. And they watched and they bet on either AFL cricket or soccer matches, depending on what they bet the most on in real life. Each participant placed bets on 5 games, and 4 of those had an inducement and 1 had no inducement. They were told the 2 teams playing were evenly matched. We provided them with a $4 stake for each game. Each game offered 3 betting options, which varied in degree of risk and inversely proportional to the potential payoff. I'll show you what that means in a moment. And importantly, the winnings accrued to their actual take-home compensation. So one of the difficulties in gambling, experimental gambling research, is simulating that people are actually playing and risking their own money. It's not much good saying, if you're just doing it for points, because money is so critical to the gambling experience. And so Matt Rockloff has developed a system where we can, and obviously this is all approved by ethics, where we can build winnings into people's take-home compensation for participating in the research. So whether they win or lose has some meaning and some value to them, shall we say. We're only talking about small amounts of money, but still it's better than playing for matchsticks and pretending that that's, simulating reality, which obviously it isn't. Okay, don't worry about that bit in the corner too much. Okay, so as I said, there were 5 games. So there was a baseline condition, like a control condition, bet $4 on your winning team, whether it's A or B going to win. The first type of, or one type of inducements was better odds or winning. So bet $4, boost your odds, payouts for winning bets are double. The next type was a bonus bet, so receive a bonus bet if your winning team is ahead at half-time. These were the experimental conditions. Reduce risk if your team wins the toss but loses the game, get double your money back. And a cash rebate, bet $4, $2 cash back, win or lose. So they were the experimental conditions, 1 control condition with no inducement and 4 inducement types. It wasn't the content that I wanted you to see. I just wanted to show you that the simulation was pretty realistic. So this is how we transmitted or relayed the results from the experiment to people. Okay, again, just summarising key results here. What that experimental stage showed was that those bets, or that participants considered the bets with inducements as significantly more attractive than bets without inducements, which was hardly a surprise, but I guess this is the first time that's been shown. So you'll see that the least attractive on this measure was the baseline condition without an inducement. The most attractive was the better odds and winnings or winnings inducement. But all of those inducements were considered more attractive than the baseline condition. What we had hypothesised was supported, that inducements led to riskier betting. And so the graph shows the mean level of risk of the betting option, so they, too complicated. People could choose, I suppose, level 1, 2, 3 of risk, with 3 being the highest. And you'll see that the baseline condition then, so I could be using the pointer really, attracted the lowest level of risk, and the cash rebate in this case attracted the highest level of risk in terms of betting. So what this indicates then is, at least under experimental conditions, which we worked really hard to try and make as realistic as possible, that adding inducements to a bet is likely to increase the likelihood of someone taking longer odds or taking more risks on that bet. And why is that important? It's important because the longer odds on a bet, the greater likelihood of a bigger pool of losing bettors. So if you've got long odds on a bet, winners are grinners, the winners get more, but you have a bigger pool of losing bettors, yeah? More bettors are likely to lose, put very simply. So that increases the harm, I guess, or spreads the harm amongst a bigger pool of bettors. You've got a few bettors who win big, good for them, but you've got a lot more bettors who lose. I'll just talk a little bit about the eye tracking study. For advertisements to be effective, they first have to gain attention, and so we used eye tracking equipment and software to track visual attention to various ads with inducements that we showed participants. So we wanted to see whether attention to inducements was greater, or people gave greater attention to inducements in an advertisement than they did to responsible gambling information in the advertisement and terms and conditions that are showed in the advertisement. I think we knew the answer to this to start with, pretty obvious, but sometimes you've got to do work on the obvious so you can actually say to policymakers and regulators, here's the evidence, you know. And we also wanted to see whether certain inducements attract more attention, and again do that by gambler risk group. So eye tracking is the most accurate way that we know of to actually, as the name suggests, track exactly where people are looking in, for example, an advertisement or some visual stimuli. So we had 61 participants and they watched 6 gambling advertisements. So 4 featured an inducement, different types of inducements, and 2 of the ads were just brand awareness ads with no inducement. Probably don't need to worry about the numbers too much, although there's some numbers for you, Chris. Again, not surprisingly, all participants paid more attention to the inducement information than to the responsible gambling information or the terms and conditions, despite the responsible gambling and terms and conditions information being presented on the screen for longer than the actual information about the inducement. So not surprisingly, people's attention is on the bells and whistles and the inducement and the offer and the something for nothing, and not surprisingly not on the little small print at the bottom of the screen that says gamble responsibly. Not too many surprises there. We were also able to see which inducements attracted most visual attention, and all PGSI groups paid most attention to the reduced risk, so the money back, stake back offer, and cashback type inducements, and particularly those with gambling problems. So you'll see here people with gambling problems found or paid most visual attention to the reduced risk offer, followed by cashback. And that pattern was, those two types of inducements were the most attractive to every group, pretty much. But the cashback was most attractive to the low risk. Yeah, as severity went up, problem gambling severity, the attraction of the reduced risk relative attractiveness seemed to go up as well. Direct messages study. So we started the WIMP project, and I think quite a few months in, we kind of had chats with Rosa and Tony and some others saying, you know, one thing we're hearing a lot about in this study are these direct emails and SMSs and that people are getting from wagering operators pushing inducements and encouraging betting, etc., etc. And it's not something that we'd really previously built into this study. So we wanted to look at the volume and types and content of these messages. And with the foundation, we decided to do that in the lead up to some major events. And we also wanted to look at, you know, well, does receiving those messages, does that appear to influence gambling expenditure? So we had two stages. We had a sports betting stage and a race betting stage. So we had around 100 regular sports bettors and 110 regular race bettors participate. And again, we use that EMA, that ecological momentary assessment methodology, very short surveys, in this case for 7 days, for a pool of sports bettors leading up to the AFL and NRL grand finals, and then a group of sports race bettors in the week of the Melbourne Cup, the Spring Racing Carnival. And we captured through those daily surveys the volume of direct text, emails and phone calls that these punters received during that week, their self-reported influence on their betting, and we also captured their expenditure. So, you know, how much did they spend betting that day? So we had this daily data for 7 days. And then we also asked the participants to forward the texts and emails they received to us. Not every email and text was forwarded to us. VJ was probably really happy about that because she already had 900 and something to analyse anyway, but certainly it gave us a feel for the types of messages that people, or the content that people were receiving. So how many messages? The sports bettors received 592 in total and the race bettors over 1,000. For both groups, about 40% of them were texts and about 60% were emails. And we also asked people, well, you know, this is the lead up to the Melbourne Cup or the grand final, you know, are you receiving more or less or about the same number of messages or volume of messages at other times of the year? And quite surprisingly, most bettors reported receiving about the same volume of messages at other times of the year. We were quite surprised about that. The content of the messages, the 931 that VJ analysed that were forwarded to us, 209 were about sports betting, 722 about race betting. But what did they actually promote? So you can see in the table that about 30 or nearly 40% of sports betting and race betting messages we were forwarded didn't promote a particular bet type. They were more sort of brand awareness, or, you know, encouraging you to make a deposit or whatever, or bet with us kind of thing. But 50% of sports betting messages and 2/3 of race betting messages were encouraging people or promoting a particular bet on an outcome of a game. So, you know, that so-and-so was going to win, or bet on, you know, a head-to-head bet for the grand final, for example. And so these don't add to 100 because some of the messages promoted more than one thing. And in sports, 37%, in races, 17% promoted an exotic bet, so betting on some in-match contingency, so who might score the first goal or the first behind or whatever. 70% of the sports betting messages and 88% of the race betting messages contained inducements to bet. So this is a channel being very actively used by operators to push inducements, wagering inducements. And it kind of flies under the radar really because it's not in the public domain, and you know, maybe regulators and the general public are just not aware of the volume of that happening. Why would you be? Why would we be? So in terms of the types of incentives then, you can see in that table that the most frequent type of incentive promoted was a bonus bet. So the sports betting messages were the bonus bet and rewards points, and for the race betting was the bonus bet, reduced risk stake back offers and better odds and winnings. Okay, so again, Matt Brown, no, Alex Russell did this, I think, Alex and Matt, used a linear mixed effects model analysis to again look at that sort of longitudinal pattern, if you like, between exposure to these messages and expenditure. And take-home message really is that receiving emails was associated with betting intention, receiving texts was associated with a higher likelihood of betting and more betting expenditure or higher betting expenditure. Even controlling for those signature betting days such as Grand Final Day, Melbourne Cup Day and problem gambling status. Again, same type of table where we can, as before, where we can see that the sports bettors who received 0 messages on that day had an average expenditure on betting of $32 or $33. When they received 5+ direct messages, average expenditure went up to $63. Same pattern for the race bettors as well. And the self-reported responses, as I said, we asked people some self-report data. People said their most common response to those messages, direct messages, was to bet with the operator sending the message. So again, that's about sort of market share, I guess, placing more bets, being reminded to bet, and placing bets that they hadn't planned to bet. Okay, so I might try and do this in about 4 minutes and leave some time for questions. So what can we draw from all that study? Clearly that's a pretty quick overview of a very in-depth piece of work. Well, not surprisingly, I think we can safely conclude that these advertisements and inducements are prolific, that punters have ongoing exposure on a near daily basis to these forms of marketing. And many are pushed via emails, SMS, you know, when people are watching sports or races or using other media. I mean, it's quite understandable that people might go looking for advertisements and specials on websites, but a lot of this stuff just comes incidentally to people when they're doing other things. The experiment certainly showed that inducements encourage riskier betting. As we were saying, riskier betting results in a larger pool of losing bettors, so it's a concern if people are taking riskier bets. And doing so because of inducements, which is what the experiment showed. We also showed that inducements and advertisements were linked to increased betting expenditure, and that's because of the riskier betting that the experiment showed, because you're more likely to lose, so therefore you're more likely to spend more, but also the EMA longitudinal analysis and the direct messages longitudinal analysis found increased exposure was linked to increased betting expenditure. And we also had that through self-report data, and that came through the interviews that we conducted. I can't remember how many interviews we did now, 30 or 40 I think. And that was quite a common experience people relayed to, was that their betting increased in response to this marketing. Some types of advertisements and inducements appear to particularly influence betting more than others. So we certainly had an effect from aggregate or total exposure to those adverts and inducements, but some appeared to be more influential than others. Betting brands promoted during events, direct messages, adverts on betting websites and apps, commentary, and particular inducements such as the stake back offer, multi-bet, and rewards points offers. That effect didn't differ amongst different PGSI groups, so it had that effect amongst all PGSI groups. I think we need to remember that these were all regular bettors though as well. Okay, so what considerations might we give to those results or to any changes in policy and practice, well, I'm not a policy maker and I'm just sort of making suggestions here really, and it'll be interesting to see how regulators may or may not respond to these pieces of work. You know, we could think about restricting or banning inducements. I mean, from a purely harm minimisation perspective, that's what you'd want to be doing. But there's also the argument, of course, that people may just go offshore and bet with illegal offshore operators if offers are restricted a lot in Australia. So that's not an issue that I'm here to resolve. But certainly inducements appeal to punters because they're thought, I think people perceive them as helping to minimise losses. You know, I'll get bonus bets, I'll get extra, I'll get a refund offer, but really they're actually increasing losses. And so I think at the very minimum we need to be very careful about how these inducements are promoted. That they shouldn't be promoted in a way that says, oh, you know, guaranteed money back, or this is a safer betting strategy, or anything like that. And I think we need to educate consumers to discourage them betting in a more risky fashion or betting more just because inducements are offered, and to actually educate them that inducements are in fact not a safer betting strategy for them. We've seen some efforts to reduce wagering advertising, so during children's television viewing hours. I'll just make the point that it's not sufficient to just do that through to traditional media channels such as television, because operators transition to online and social media and mobile platforms, and they're of course much harder to regulate and to monitor as well. And I really think, and I think Vijay and Alex, who worked on the direct messaging stage of this study, really feel that, you know, direct messages have flown below the radar. They're not in the public domain. They're often not considered advertising by law, because I know in New South Wales, for example, direct messages don't come under their restrictions on inducements, because the direct messages are only sent to account holders, and account holders are seen to, that it's not seen to be in the public domain, it's not advertising at large. But I think they're highly problematic because, as we saw, 70 to 80 or nearly 90% of them promote inducements to gamble. So at minimum, you know, we would recommend an opt-in system at least to these inducements rather than the current opt-out system. And operators, of course, could limit their frequency. Okay, so to finish, despite some limitations, we feel that this study provides the strongest evidence to date that, guess what, advertising works. Who would have thought? And increases, to go back to those questions, both market share and overall consumption of wagering. We know from the Hilda data that around 40% of at least monthly bettors in Australia are at risk or problem gamblers. I mean, that's an alarming figure. And so how, you know, so these inducements and advertisements are impacting that group of population, and thereby increasing gambling harm. So, that was a bit of a marathon, really. You can read all about it in that report. I'm sure I've inspired you to do that. And at that point, I think I'll stop. Yeah, look, I mean, certainly we can't absolutely demonstrate causation in this, you know, and I don't think there'd be any advertising study that could actually do that. Even longitudinal studies, I don't think, can point to causation. And your example's a good one. So we know that people with more accounts see more advertising, but we also know people open accounts, self-report that they open accounts in response to advertising, such as sign-up bonuses as well. So, you know, I think it probably works both ways. I guess, you know, we consider this the strongest evidence to date of that link between advertising and expenditure due to the multiple stages and the convergence of the evidence across those different stages. But you're absolutely right, there is like every other gambling study, every other advertising study, you cannot demonstrate absolute causation from advertising through to expenditure. Yeah. I mean, direct messages, for example, just arrive uninvited and unannounced, so I don't know how you intend to look for those. I think most people would, well, obviously it's hard not to read the text message when it's there, but you're absolutely right in terms of emails. No, but no, so we didn't ask that, but I think the pattern of results that show that, the more messages that are received, betting expenditure goes up in line with the number of messages received. Perhaps intentionality would be some sort of moderating factor in there. Perhaps it isn't, but we didn't measure that, no. I don't know if every operator offers it, but I think they probably do. So you can opt out of that marketing, but I think most people just don't, they just... And look, some people no doubt find it really useful as well. This is the thing too, so yeah. But, I mean, we have opt-out on a whole lot of other things that we don't use. Well, I do anyways. No, that's right. And we didn't find a difference in any of the stages between the PGSI groups. So between the EMA stage, the ones with numbers, the EMA stage, the experimental stage, direct messaging, eye tracking. We were really surprised as well that there were no effects. And I think you could be right, Chris, where, each stage had fairly contained numbers in it. So we didn't have, mammoth surveys with thousands of people. But I think the other explanation there is in the EMA stage and the experimental stage and the direct messaging stage, all of the participants were regular bettors, at least fortnightly bettors. Now, I think if, say, the non-problem gambling group, for example, or low risk, whatever, had included some people who bet once a year or twice a year, maybe the results might have been different. I mean, I don't know, I'm speculating. But because they were all a pool of regular bettors, maybe they, that might explain some of that. So what I didn't put up were the respondent characteristics. So going from memory, in the EMA stage, I think it was 16% of sports bettors and 17% of race bettors, could have been the other way around, were in the problem gambling category of the PGSI. And then the other groups, moderate risk, low risk and non-problem, were fairly evenly spread, 20, whatever that adds up to be, 26, 7, 8% in each of those other categories. So the four PGSI categories were fairly evenly spaced out with except that there were only about 16 to 17% of the 100% were in the problem gambling category. So I think we captured sufficient numbers there, but whether people in that problem gambling group who responded were different from the ones who didn't respond, we don't really know. Alex did do some analysis to see whether people who had dropped out early were different from those who hadn't, and there weren't any differences, I recall, by age and gender. Yeah. I'm not sure I could comment more on that. Yeah, so, the results may well have been different if we'd had a more representative, or a less intense betting sample, I guess. Who knows? Who knows? Who knows? But, I still come back to the notion that 40% of bettors in Australia, at least monthly bettors, are at risk or fall into the at-risk or problem gambling categories, and so intensive betting and problematic betting is not that unusual amongst that population of bettors, it seems. So.